Report 1. Since childhood, a connection to the supernatural seemed to be etched into my destiny, as if something beyond myself was shaping my life. With this intuition, I have accumulated many stories that defy logic and understanding. Today, I share a terrifying experience that happened just a few weeks ago, which confirmed my worst fears. From a young age, we are warned by our mothers or grandmothers to never leave dishes unwashed overnight, claiming that it could serve as an invitation for entities from another world. Last night, disregarding this ancestral warning, I witnessed the terrifying truth of these tales. Currently, I live in Houston, Texas, after we moved from Chicago in search of a better life for me and my husband. We faced challenges in finding a home, but managed to settle into a modest apartment. We have 2 roommates who work in construction and return late at night. My sister-in-law studies and I work remotely, spending most of my time alone. The routine on Saturdays is always the same. My roommates go out to drink with friends and only return during the early morning or even the next day. I prepare their food in the microwave so that they can heat it up when they arrive, making a lot of noise throughout the house. Last night, I prepared a chicken broth, a traditional recipe for combating hangovers, as usual. After an exhausting day, my roommates showered and went out for the night. My husband, tired, fell asleep around 10 p.m. When he received a call offering double pay to work on Sunday, he accepted the offer. I decided to go down to the kitchen, get something ready for lunch, and take the opportunity to eat. When I went downstairs, I noticed that my roommates hadn't returned yet and all the doors were locked with double padlocks. I thought they would only arrive the next day. The kitchen was a mess and all the dinner dishes were dirty. Before we proceed with more revelations about terror stories, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and click like if you're enjoying the content. Your interaction is crucial for us to continue unraveling mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below which city you're watching from, to know how far our terrifying stories are reaching. Now, let's dive even deeper into this fascinating story. I informed my husband that I was going downstairs to wash the dishes, but he asked me not to do it, as it was late and I always take care of these tasks. I put on my headphones and started listening to stories, a way to relax before sleeping. My husband fell asleep quickly, and I, used to staying up late, decided to go to sleep at midnight to wake up early to prepare lunch. Around midnight, I was awakened by a strong aroma of broth and a smell of burnt dough, followed by loud noises coming from the kitchen, living room, and dining area. I heard the blinds and the sliding door to the balcony being opened. This didn't surprise me much, as it was typical behavior of one of my roommates when returning drunk. However, the smell of burning alarmed me, and I was concerned if someone had left the stove on. This had happened before, and luckily, the house had not caught fire. A strange feeling compelled me to go downstairs, as if something was deeply wrong. All the doors were locked with double padlocks, making it impossible for anyone to enter, even with a key. Fear began to take over me, so I decided not to go down. But the noises persisted, and it was evident that someone was moving around the lower part of the house. The noise was so intense that my husband woke up annoyed, believing his brothers were making too much noise and disturbing the neighbors, who have a small baby. He said he would go down to check, but I held him back, insisting it wasn't his brothers down there. My husband, with a look of concern, asked who it could be then. I replied that I didn't know, but whatever was down there, it wasn't them. He then picked up his phone and sent messages to his brothers asking where they were. Only one replied, confirming they were at a bar with friends and asking if everything was okay. My husband tried to hide his fear and said it was probably Daniel or Chaparro, as our roommates are called, but that he would go down to ask them to make less noise. I insisted on going down with him, but he laughed and said it was no problem. When we went down, what we found was beyond any rational explanation. There was no one in the house. The doors were locked, as I had seen earlier, and the smell of food had disappeared. However, the lights in the living room and kitchen were on and the blinds on the balcony were open. The most disturbing, however, was the fact that all the kitchen chairs were stacked on top of the table, a pattern we never left and that seemed to have been done with a clear intention. Upon investigating further, we found a mysterious note on the kitchen table. It was written in handwriting I did not recognize. The invitation was accepted. Now what is lost forever. Fear and confusion took over us, as there was no logical explanation for what we found there. What really happened that night has never been fully clarified. The most logical explanations could not capture the essence of the terror we experienced. Since then, we have never left dishes unwashed overnight, and the feeling that something inexplicable may be lurking has never left us. The silent presence of something unknown remains, a constant reminder that some doors should never be opened. Report 2. Since childhood, something inexplicable seemed to follow me, a disturbing sensation that the supernatural was an inseparable part of my life. For many years, I tried to ignore and rationalize these experiences. However, the truth is that not all presences are harmless, and some can be profoundly disturbing and even dangerous. What I am about to share is an experience that forever changed my perception of the spiritual world. I studied biology at Camden State University, located in a rural town in Michigan. The course included field practices, which were the highlight of my weeks. We visited places like mysterious caves and nearly unexplored forest regions. These experiences, though intense, never included supernatural encounters, something I considered almost a miracle, given the time we spent immersed in the darkness of nature. At night, around the campfire, we shared horror stories, often about figures like the legend of the White Lady, and about experiences of classmates who came from remote communities and had their own stories of fear. It was in mid-October 2019, during one of these trips, that my view of the paranormal took a terrifying turn. Our team went to a small village in the interior of Michigan, a place that will remain anonymous out of respect for the local residents. The plan was to spend 3 days and 2 nights in a rustic hostel, known for its charming and sometimes unsettling atmosphere. We arrived at the village around 11 a.m. and were accommodated in different cabins. After leaving our things, we began exploring the surroundings, guided by a local. We set up nets to capture birds, traps for small mammals, and installed monitoring cameras. As night fell, we returned to the hostel to eat and prepare for the nighttime activities. The hosts, originally from the north of the country, served extremely spicy food. With a low tolerance for strong spices, I opted to bring my own food, meaning I would spend most of the time alone in the cabin. On the first night, after a tiring day, I returned to the cabin before the others. I took the moment to take a shower and relax. While I was in the shower, I heard a faint movement in the bedroom area, followed by a whispering voice calling my name. The sound was almost inaudible, but disturbing enough to make me stop immediately. I asked if anyone was there, but got no response. Fear began to take over, and I hurried to leave the shower. The girls should have been returning from dinner, but the absolute silence was disconcerting. As soon as I stepped out of the bathroom, I noticed that the cabin lights were flickering intermittently. The environment felt colder than usual, and a sensation of being watched invaded me. I checked all the doors and windows. They were all locked, which was curious because I was alone and there should be no reason for any feeling of insecurity. The flashlight on my table flickered more and more until it went out completely, plunging the place into total darkness. I decided to use my cell phone light to search for the cause of the problem, but as I walked through the rooms, the environment seemed to change. The corridor appeared longer than normal, and the furniture was displaced, as if someone had entered and messed with everything. My heart pounding, I began to search for a logical explanation, but the sense of dread only grew. I heard the whisper again, clearer this time, seeming to come from the upstairs where there was no one. I decided to go up, and as I ascended the stairs, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me, but when I looked back, there was no one there. Fear paralyzed me, and the darkness seemed to swallow every corner of the house. When I reached the upper floor, the silence was overwhelming, and the atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable presence. In the room where I was staying, I found something that shouldn't have been there. On my bed, there was a small wooden box with a message carved, "What is yours was never yours." Fear turned to panic, and I immediately turned to go down the stairs and look for the other girls. When the girls finally returned, they were visibly disturbed. They reported hearing strange noises while dining, as if something was banging against the walls and dragging furniture in the dark. However, they dismissed the sounds as simply the noise of an old and poorly maintained house. With a sense of unrest hanging over us, we decided to investigate the cabin, hoping to find some logical explanation for the events I had experienced. We searched every corner of the cabin, from the dusty attic to the damp and poorly lit basement. We found only what seemed to be the common setting of an old house: cobwebs, old furniture, and a thick layer of dirt. The mysterious box, which I had found on the first night, was treated as a tasteless joke, an object of no value that someone had hidden to scare us. However, even after we discarded the box and our investigation, the feeling of apprehension did not leave us. The psychological terror was beginning to take over all of us. The second night descended like a black and oppressive cloak. The whispers and strange noises that had started before intensified. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors of the cabin, but when we went to check, there was no one there. The wind, which before was just a light whisper, now howled as if the very house was crying. The shadows on the walls danced in patterns that had no explanation. Each of us felt an invisible and oppressive presence, as if we were being watched by unseen eyes, which viewed each of our movements with macabre curiosity. During the night, the feeling of discomfort was palpable. I, who had already gone through so many inexplicable experiences, could not escape the terror that surrounded us. My classmates were equally terrified, some crying softly, others in absolute silence, paralyzed by fear. The field activities were interrupted, but what really interrupted our work was the constant psychological terror we felt. Something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't identify what it was. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable and nameless fear. On the last day, the relief of leaving the hostel was immediate. The sun seemed brighter and the air fresher as we loaded our bags onto the bus. We were all eager to leave, without looking back. However, as we were preparing to depart, I noticed something disturbing. On the floor of the cabin, right in the center of the main room, there was a small hole, the size of a coin, with a piece of paper visible through it. With a racing heart, I crouched down and pulled the paper out. It was an aged and torn note, with a message written in faded red ink: "You should not have come. Now you are part of our story." The bus departed, and as I looked out the window, I saw the hostel slowly receding. However, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. The fear persisted, not just from what had happened, but from what could still come. The memory of that night remained etched in my mind, an indelible mark that not even time could erase. Dreams and nightmares merged, and many times I awoke sweating coldly, with a racing heart, feeling the same terror of those nights. Today, I share this story in hopes of warning others. There are forces beyond our understanding, forces that not only haunt us but have the power to change our lives forever. The feeling that something is out of place has never left me, and the memory of that night continues to haunt my dreams and thoughts. Some mysteries remain unsolved not because we did not try to understand them, but because some truths are darker than our minds can bear. And sometimes, it's better to leave certain things unresolved and beyond our comprehension. Report 3. Rarely in my life have I mustered enough courage to share what really happened in that forgotten town, a story that still sends chills down my spine. The narrative I am about to recount took place in a small border town in the United States called Oakwood, a place so forgotten it became a ghost of urban memories. Oakwood was known for its abandoned neighborhood, an urbanization project that was never completed. The houses, sold at ludicrously low prices to the poorest, were left unfinished, without basic services and without a decent path to reach them. The place resembled a ghost town, a labyrinth of deserted streets and unfinished houses, enveloped by a disconcerting silence. It was there that I ended up, without a place to call my own, seeking refuge. A friend, aware of my situation, offered me one of his houses in the abandoned neighborhood, on the condition that I look after it while he considered officially abandoning it. With no better options, I accepted. When I arrived, I realized that the neighborhood was almost completely deserted. Only a few houses still had sporadic residents, and I was one of the few who actually made use of the facilities. Among the neighbors, some vagrants ventured through the streets, trying to loot or vandalize the properties. I kept myself armed for protection and occasionally received some change from neighboring homeowners to help look after their properties as well. The first night in Oakwood was quiet. I made rounds on the street, ensuring that nothing strange happened. However, everything changed when a violent storm hit the city, bringing chaos of strong winds and torrential rains. I went out for a walk, concerned about potential intruders trying to shelter from the storm, when I noticed the red and blue lights of a police car illuminating the gloomy neighborhood. Only one police officer, a tall, thin woman named Emily, was patrolling alone. She approached and asked if I was a watchman or something. When I explained that I was not, she revealed that a horrible smell was emanating from one of the houses on the upper street. Apparently, a resident who had gone to check on his property noticed that the odor came from a house inhabited by a solitary man. Concerned that he might be dead and no one had noticed, Emily asked for my help to check the situation. There was genuine fear in her eyes, and she confessed that she had requested backup, but no one could arrive in time due to the storm. The urgency in her voice made me decide to accompany her. We walked to the house in question, which stood out among the others for its particularly worn appearance. As we approached, the nauseating smell of rotting flesh mixed with the aroma of the storm. Emily and I knocked on the door, and hearing a weak moan from inside, our anxiety increased. Finally, we managed to break down the metal door with considerable effort. What we saw inside was beyond any expectations. The house was in total disorder, with broken furniture and accumulated dust. However, what shocked me the most was the body of a man lying at the table, his presence still fresh and dreadful. The scene was one of absolute despair. The man was visibly injured, but there were no signs of life. Emily desperately searched for anyone else in the house, but all we found were traces of unspeakable horror. The man's body was in a position that seemed to indicate he had tried to get up but failed. The moan we had heard could have been an echo of what remained of his agony, or perhaps a sound distorted by terror. After that night, the experience marked me in a way I could never have imagined. I stayed in the town for 2 more months, while trying to find a job and a safer place to live. Eventually, I got a job in a factory and rented a small room in the town. Time passed, and Oakwood slowly became a distant memory. However, the image of that night never left me. What haunts me is not just the horror of that encounter, but the feeling that something much more sinister was happening there. Emily, the police officer, was never seen there again after that night. Silence returned to Oakwood, and the feeling that something was wrong, something we will never fully understand, persists to this day. The events of that night remain like a shadow in my mind, a reminder that there are forces and mysteries beyond our understanding and control. Sometimes, some truths are too dark to be revealed, and the line between the known and the unknown is much thinner than we imagine. What disturbs me the most is how Oakwood seems to have swallowed the police back into its somber silence, as if the town had a will of its own, a malevolent presence that absorbs anything that dares to disturb its mortuary peace. As the months passed and I adjusted to life in the new town, the past never completely faded away. The fateful night was always lurking in my thoughts, and the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. There was something peculiar about the way things unfolded after that event. The town was imbued with a feeling of hopelessness, a kind of melancholy that seemed to overflow from the walls of the abandoned houses. On stormy days, I began to fear that the cycle would repeat itself, that the winds would bring back what had been buried. I knew there was something profoundly wrong in Oakwood, something that was not merely a matter of urban decay, but a manifestation of an ancient and perverse evil. One night, not long after my move, as I tried to sleep, a chilling cold took over my room. The temperature suddenly dropped, and the sound of dragging footsteps through the deserted streets seemed almost palpable. I sat up in bed, trying to understand if I was dreaming or if reality had transformed into something more sinister. The creaking of a door opening and closing repeatedly echoed through the house, and I could not ignore the feeling that someone or something was approaching. The tension escalated until, one night, I decided to confront my fears. I went out into the street, armed only with a flashlight and a revolver. The streets were deserted and silent, but there was something unsettling in the air. Each shadow seemed to have its own shape, each breeze seemed to carry incomprehensible whispers. The neighborhood was immersed in a cloak of darkness, and the houses, with their broken windows and hanging doors, seemed to be watching. It was then that I realized, the house where Emily and I found the body was even more deteriorated than before. The door was open, swinging gently with the wind. A feeling of dread overwhelmed me, but driven by the need for answers, I entered. The interior was in a worse state than when I had seen it for the first time. The smell of decomposition was more intense, but what was really disturbing were the signs that someone had still been there. The walls were covered with messages written in red ink, words that seemed to form a warning, a premonition. As I explored the house, a cold draft swept through the hallway, and a feeling of presence became almost physical. I felt as if I were being watched by invisible eyes. Finally, I reached the room where the body from the past was, and what I found there made my blood run cold. The table was once again empty, but now there was a new body sitting in front of it, a body that seemed to be waiting patiently. There were no signs of violence, just an expression of deep suffering on the face. I backed away in panic, and as I took one last look around, I realized something even more disturbing. On the walls, the words written seemed to have changed, now forming coherent sentences suggesting that the house was alive, that the evil inhabiting Oakwood fed on the fear and pain of those who dared to enter. I felt an invisible force trying to push me away, a kind of pressure that forced me to leave the house hastily. I fled that night and never returned to Oakwood. The experiences I lived there profoundly transformed me. The feeling of being watched never completely left me, and the psychological terror I experienced manifested in constant nightmares and anxieties. I moved to another town, but Oakwood and its deserted houses remained like a scar on my soul. What happened in that abandoned town made me realize that there are forces beyond our understanding, that there are places where evil is much more deeply rooted than we imagine. Oakwood was not just a deserted town. It was a place where fear and pain merged into an almost palpable presence, an entity that fed on our curiosity and daring. Sometimes, as I pass by similar places, I remember the lessons I learned and the horrors I witnessed. The truth is that some mysteries should never be unearthed, and some places should remain as they are, wrapped in shadows and secrets that we are not prepared to face. The legacy of Oakwood continues to haunt my mind, reminding me that there are things that are better left in the dark, unexplored. Report 4. My name is John Hahn, and the story I'm about to tell is one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. When I was 24, I attempted to immigrate to the United States, and one of my first attempts was marked by an event so terrifying that to this day, I still feel the weight of fear and uncertainty. At that time, I was crossing the isolated mountains of Utah, a desolate region where the darkness of night seemed to swallow everything around it. The journey was brutal, and the feeling that the day was rapidly fading was constant. As the sun hid, the nights became endless and relentlessly cold. I was accompanied by a small group of immigrants, all in pursuit of the same dream, a better life in the United States. After an exhausting day of walking, tired and disoriented, we decided to take a break. We were in a clearing surrounded by dense trees and slippery rocks. The darkness around us was almost tangible, and the feeling of being lost in a hostile place was palpable. I was particularly alert, fearful of wild animals and venomous insects, and also because there were women and children in our group. The group consisted of Maria, a Mexican lady with anxious eyes, Juan, a young Colombian, Elena, a Peruvian mother with her 2 small children, and Alejandro, a Colombian who had become my friend during the journey. All of us were struggling to find comfort in a place that seemed increasingly hostile. As we tried to rest, Alejandro and I remained awake, watching the environment in the darkness. We could not light lanterns, as that would make us visible to the patrols that roamed the area. The silence of the night was absolute, until suddenly, a sound cut through the quietude, the crying of a baby. It was a muffled and distressing sound, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. The crying, though distant, was unmistakable. Everyone in the group woke up startled, and Maria, in particular, was panicked. She believed the crying was a sign of a lost or endangered baby. With a look of despair, she began to call for help, and the group decided to follow the sound, moving cautiously through the woods. Each step seemed more difficult than the last. The ground was covered with dry branches and slippery stones, and the trees formed a sinister curtain of shadows. Maria stumbled several times, her tears mixed with sweat and dirt. The baby's cry seemed to get closer, but when we finally reached the spot from where the sound came, we found something that left us in shock. Between two large rocks, there was a cross made of dry branches. On the cross was a small teddy bear, dirty and worn by time. The crying had ceased, and the environment was immersed in oppressive silence. The sight of the cross and the teddy bear in the midst of the forest's darkness was disturbing and desolate. It was as if fear itself had materialized before our eyes. The atmosphere around was heavy and charged with a feeling of mourning and despair. The group fell silent, and the women began to cry in unison. Maria, heartbroken, asked that we say a prayer for the baby. She believed that, according to her beliefs, this was the way to free the soul of the little one and help him find peace. The ritual was conducted with a reverence that seemed almost ritualistic. The ground was covered with dry branches and slippery stones, and the trees formed a sinister curtain of shadows. Maria stumbled several times, her tears mixed with sweat and dirt. The baby's cry seemed to get closer, but when we finally reached the spot from where the sound came, we found something that left us in shock. Between two large rocks, there was a cross made of dry branches. On the cross was a small teddy bear, dirty and worn by time. The crying had ceased, and the environment was immersed in oppressive silence. The sight of the cross and the teddy bear in the midst of the forest's darkness was disturbing and desolate. It was as if fear itself had materialized before our eyes. The atmosphere around was heavy and charged with a feeling of mourning and despair. The group fell silent, and the women began to cry in unison. Maria, heartbroken, asked that we say a prayer for the baby. She believed that, according to her beliefs, this was the way to free the soul of the little one and help him find peace. The ritual was conducted with a reverence that seemed almost ritualistic. A fervent prayer, asking for peace and relief for the baby's soul. The group, although terrified, joined her, singing hymns of lamentation and forming a circle around the cross. As the prayer continued, a sense of pressure and tension built up in the air. The candle, despite the gentle wind, seemed to struggle to keep the flame alive. The baby's cry did not return, but the sensation of something evil lurking in the shadows remained. After the ritual, the group continued their walk, but the fear and unease were palpable. The feeling that something was wrong did not leave us. During the remainder of the crossing, the environment seemed even more hostile, as if the forest were alive with invisible presences. The path seemed endless, and the sensation of being watched was constant. When we finally left the mountains and reached our destination, the experience left a deep mark on all of us. The baby's cry and Maria's ritual became a symbol of a horror that we could not fully comprehend. What really happened that night, and what caused the baby's cry, remains a mystery. The feeling of desolation and the sensation of something evil in the shadows never completely left me. This is just one of the disturbing stories I experienced on my journey to the United States. What happened that night in the Utah mountains continues to haunt my thoughts, reminding me that there are forces beyond our understanding, and that some experiences are better left in the dark. If there is interest in hearing more about other terrifying experiences, I promise to share what remains. Until then, I leave you with the image of that cross in the forest, a somber reminder that there are mysteries that will never be resolved. Report 5. In the fall of 2012 in Hanover, a small and isolated town in Pennsylvania, I, Caleb, at just 14 years old, decided to face what I believed to be a routine hunting trip. The town, with its quiet streets and old houses, seemed the perfect place to escape the turmoil of modern life. but that night would transform my perception of what it truly means to face the unknown. It was a humid and stifling night, and I prepared for the hunt with my trusty Savage Stevens rifle, known as Old Reliable. Since my father gave me the gun at the age of 12, it had never failed to provide me with a safe and successful hunting experience. I was accustomed to hunting on the family farm, which stretched across vast areas of dense forests and immense fields. When I reached my hunting post, an old wooden stand built by my grandfather, the atmosphere felt particularly charged. The trees around were shrouded in fog, and the darkness seemed denser than usual. The clock marked 3 p.m., and I settled into my observation spot, as usual, prepared to wait until nightfall. However, what should have been a peaceful hunt turned into a nightmare. As the sun set at 5:30 p.m., an inexplicable phenomenon began to unfold before my eyes. Normally, I would spot deer or other animals before this time, but that night, the field was deserted. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. It was then that I noticed a strange light in the farm's valley. Initially, I thought it was a hunter on neighboring lands, but the light moved erratically. It seemed like a flashlight, but its movement was unusual, almost as if it were guided by something not human. I stood up from my position and watched the light more closely. It seemed to be searching for something, moving slowly and aimlessly. I decided to shout, trying to alert the person that they were trespassing on the property. My voice echoed through the darkness, but the light stopped abruptly, as if the person had frozen in place. The silence that followed the shout was an abyss of stillness, a pause so deep it felt as if the world itself had held its breath. The darkness intensified around me, enveloping the landscape in a dense and suffocating cloak. The light, previously erratic and unsettling, remained still, like an invisible sentinel watching from a hidden position. Time seemed to drag while the light remained fixed, its immobility more terrifying than its erratic movement had been. After about 10 minutes, which felt like hours, the light began to move again, but this time with a disturbing purpose. Instead of a regular progression, it seemed to float, swaying in the air as if guided by forces beyond human comprehension. Its trajectory was erratic and unpredictable, as if it were being manipulated by invisible hands guiding it with a sinister intent. As the light approached my stand, it seemed to grow in intensity, briefly illuminating the trees around and revealing a landscape previously hidden by darkness. Each movement of the light was accompanied by an oppressive silence, making the small sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the whispering of the wind, seem loud and disturbing. When the light finally got close enough to illuminate the stand, the environment around me transformed into a nightmarish scene. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch and contract in impossible ways, creating forms that appeared to twist and move autonomously. The hunting stand, normally a safe and familiar place, now felt like a prison surrounded by unsettling darkness. Suddenly, the light turned abruptly and headed into the dense forest surrounding the property. My heart raced with an intensity one had never known before. The air was heavy with a palpable sense of dread, and the idea that something indescribable was lurking in the darkness made me feel vulnerable and exposed. The light disappeared into the forest, leaving behind an even deeper void, a darkness that seemed alive and breathing. Then, an inhuman scream erupted from the forest. It was a sound that defied logic, a harrowing mix of pain and terror that seemed to penetrate every fiber of my being. The scream was so close that I could feel the vibration in the earth beneath my feet. It was as if the forest itself was screaming, an expression of pain and despair that could not be described in human words. The feeling that something was rapidly approaching, that an invisible force was pursuing me, was overwhelming. I gathered my gear with almost frantic speed, my hand trembling as I held the rifle, and ran to the ATV. The engine rumbled low and unsettling as I tried to start the vehicle, my mind in a state of absolute panic. When the ATV finally roared into motion, I accelerated with desperate speed, dust rising behind me as I fled from the field. The ride back home was a frenetic race, with a sensation of something following me, a premonition that the terror was materializing in the shadows behind me. I could barely breathe. The feeling of panic was so intense it felt as if the air was becoming thinner with every second. I arrived home in a state of total exhaustion, with my hands still trembling and my heart racing. My grandfather was in the basement, waiting with a look of concern. I looked at him, trying to hide the truth behind a distant and empty gaze. When he asked about the hunt, I lied, saying I had seen nothing unusual. I kept the terror I experienced that night locked within me, unable to find words that could capture the magnitude of what I had experienced. Since that night, I have returned to the farm on several occasions, but always carrying an uncomfortable feeling, a sense that something still remains there, hidden in the depths of the forest. Hunting continues to be an activity I enjoy, but the shadow of that night has never fully dissipated. The memories of the agonizing scream and the strange light remain vivid, a constant reminder that there are forces and phenomena that transcend our understanding. If anyone has faced something similar or encountered a mystery they cannot explain, I would love to hear your story. Sometimes, knowing that others have gone through similar experiences can offer a bit of comfort amid the unknown. Until then, I will continue to hunt, always with an eye to the shadows, hoping that what happened that night never repeats. Report 6. Have you ever felt the unsettling sensation of being watched while walking alone on the street, and when you look back, there's absolutely nothing? I wish it were always like that, but that night in Chicago in 2015, the sensation of being watched transformed into a terror that I've never been able to forget. That night, after a routine and friendly game of basketball with friends, I decided to ride my bike home. The city was quiet, and the silence of the night felt like a heavy cloak covering the deserted streets. Since public transportation in my area isn't the best, the bicycle became my preferred mode of transport. It was just past 10 p.m. when I started pedaling back. As I left the sports center, one of my colleagues commented that the moon was particularly large and full that night. Another, jokingly, talked about witches and werewolves, and we all laughed about it, not imagining what was about to happen. I said goodbye and went on my way. In the first few kilometers, everything was peaceful. There was a disturbing absence of cars and people, which for a normally busy neighborhood, seemed unusual. The night was almost stifling, and the profound silence began to bother me. I didn't give it much thought and continued pedaling, trying to enjoy the calm. I reached a street that I needed to cross to cut through. If I didn't pass through there, the route to my home would extend by more than 30 minutes, which at that hour, was not a viable option. My mother always got anxious about my arrival, and I didn't want to worry anyone else. This street, a necessary passage, seemed straight out of a horror movie. The trees along the way were very tall, their canopies forming a dense green curtain that almost hid the sky. The public lighting was minimal, and the pavement was irregular, alternating between worn asphalt, loose cobblestone, and dirt. In the middle of the street, an old and gloomy building, a convent of the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Anne, stood like a Gothic specter. The moon, previously bright and full, began to be covered by heavy clouds, and a strong wind started to whistle through the trees. As I entered the street, the moon disappeared, plunging the path into near total darkness. The flashlight I carried, always a faithful companion, seemed not to work at that moment, as if something was obstructing the light. With the atmosphere charged and the environment tense, I advanced cautiously, each pedal stroke a conscious effort. The feeling that something was wrong became palpable, an invisible pressure that seemed to weigh on my shoulders. I reached the convent's gate, which was closed, as always. However, that night, the gate seemed to have an even more sinister aspect, as if it had transformed into an entity of its own, watching me. As I passed the convent's gate, the oppressive sensation of being watched increased exponentially. I looked around, and for a moment, I had the distinct impression that something was moving at the corner of my eyes. The sensation was so real that it made me turn my head quickly, but everything seemed normal. The gate, which had always been closed, was as always unflappable. Yet, the feeling that something invisible was watching me was inescapable. I jerked the bike's handlebars in a sudden movement, almost falling in the process. The fright made me stop immediately, trying to regain my balance with labored breathing. The air was dense, heavy, and the environment around me seemed to breathe with a life of its own. I knew I shouldn't be there, and the cold, silent atmosphere seemed to conspire against me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the heart that was wildly beating in my chest, and continued pedaling with a mix of courage and apprehension. But the discomfort persisted, as if the very air was laden with an invisible presence. Every shadow around me seemed alive, every crackle in the trees seemed to be whispering my name. As I advanced through the dark street, the sensation of being watched intensified. It was no longer just a feeling, but an anguishing certainty, as if a group of invisible eyes were intently focused on me, analyzing every move I made. The chill in my spine turned into an uncontrollable shiver, and a growing desperation began to take hold of me. It was as if the street itself was alive and was testing me, trying to drag me into the darkness. Then, on the sidewalk next to the convent, where the darkness seemed to swallow everything around, I saw the first shadow. It was black, immense, and seemed to absorb all the light around it, like a black hole in the middle of the night. It had no defined shape, but it was so intense and opaque that it seemed to merge with the darkness that enveloped it. The shadow seemed to pulse with its own energy, and as I approached, the sense of threat became almost palpable. Unable to bear the sight of that threatening shadow any longer, I sped up the bike, trying to get away from that sinister presence as quickly as possible. But the darkness seemed to move with an almost supernatural speed. I looked back, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The shadows were multiplying, transforming into indistinct and amorphous figures that seemed to crawl out of the darkness. The sensation of absolute panic overwhelmed me. I was being chased, but there was no clear form, just a mass of shadows extending in my direction. Each movement of the shadows seemed an attempt to grab me, to pull me back into the darkness. Frenetically accelerating, fear propelled me forward, and the street seemed to stretch indefinitely. Each pedal stroke was a desperate effort to escape that nightmare. Finally, upon spotting a bright light at the end of the street, I accelerated with all the strength I had left. When I crossed the line of light, I looked back one more time, expecting to see the shadows following me. However, to my surprise, there was no sign of the threatening presences. The darkness behind me was completely empty, as if the shadows had never existed. The relief was immediate, but it brought no comfort. The echo of terror still reverberated in my mind. I arrived home exhausted and panting, the fear still pulsing in my veins like a poison. My mother was waiting in the living room, and I could only say that everything was fine, hiding the terror I had experienced. Since that night, the street continues to haunt me. I have returned several times, but the sensation of something hidden in the shadows has never completely disappeared. Each visit is accompanied by a sensation of vigilance, a presence that seems to be always there, just out of sight. The memory of that night is an indelible scar on my memory, a mark that I cannot erase. The mystery of the shadows remains, an unanswered enigma, and the fear that something is still lurking in the darkness continues to haunt me. If you have ever gone through a similar experience or encountered something that defies all explanation, I would love to hear your story. Sometimes, sharing our fears can help make sense of the inexplicable. Meanwhile, I will continue to bike through the city, hoping that the shadows never find me again. And who knows, maybe one day I will discover what really lurks in the darkness of those deserted streets. Report 7. When I decided to become a social worker, I didn't know I was entering a world where the line between normal and paranormal could blur so easily. Working with people in extreme situations can be rewarding, but also deeply disturbing. Among all the cases I've handled, one in particular left an indelible mark on my mind. A case that unfolded in such a macabre way that I've never been able to stop questioning the reality I experienced. The client, whom we'll call Nathan, was a 29-year-old living in Seattle. Nathan had a history of paranoid schizophrenia, which led him to frequent several psychiatric institutions over the years. However, recently, after finding the right combination of medications, he seemed to have made significant progress. He managed to get a part-time job as a library assistant, an achievement that seemed to be a positive sign of his recovery. As his social worker, I was responsible for ensuring he was adjusting well and that his mental health remained stable. One day, after a brief scheduled meeting, I arrived at Nathan's home, which was in an old apartment building in downtown Seattle. The visit was set for a routine check, but when I arrived, I found that Nathan was not at home. I called his cell phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. Assuming he might have stayed at work longer than expected, I left a message and departed, confident he would return my contact. However, the day went by and Nathan did not return my calls or messages. I was starting to worry and planned to report the absence to my supervisor. That concern, however, was abruptly interrupted the next morning when Nathan called me. His voice was frantic and distorted by palpable anxiety. He apologized for the silence and explained that he had experienced something extraordinary and urgent, something he needed to share immediately. He asked me to come to his apartment as soon as possible. I arrived at the building around 7:30 a.m., still groggy from sleep. After climbing the creaking stairs, I knocked on Nathan's apartment door. When he finally opened, what I saw left me speechless. The upper half of his head was covered with blood-soaked bandages. The stain of dried blood on the cloths, near one of his eyes, indicated that the wound was recent and had not been properly treated. Nathan's condition was disturbing, and I immediately thought of taking him to the hospital. However, before I could suggest anything, he asked me to see something that, according to him, was more important than any immediate medical care. Nathan looked terrified and hesitant, as if he were hiding something dark. He led me through the apartment, a series of dark and dusty rooms, to a room he had transformed into a sort of makeshift laboratory. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photos of people and places, and a pile of notes that seemed to form a confusing and disturbing mosaic. In the center of the room, there was a metal box with a rusty padlock. With a trembling voice, Nathan told me he had made a disturbing discovery. He believed something evil was lurking, something he had named the Watcher. According to Nathan, for weeks, he had the constant sensation of being watched. As the days passed, he began to hear whispers and see shadows moving through the dark corridors of the building. These perceptions were not just hallucinations, he believed, but evidence of a real and threatening presence. Nathan described a particularly terrifying event. One night, when returning home, he found the metal box in his apartment. Inside it was a collection of disturbing objects, old photographs, small amulets, and a notebook full of strange symbols. Most alarming was that the book contained details of his own movements and activities, as if someone had been tracking his every step. The sense of dread was established with the opening of the box, revealing an antique pocket watch with a dial spinning backward, as if time itself was being subverted. Nathan, with a pale face and eyes wide with terror, held the watch with trembling hands, as if it were the key to a terrible mystery. The moment the object was removed from the box seemed to trigger a supernatural reaction. The environment around seemed to contract and cool. The shadows on the apartment walls stretched and distorted into grotesque and threatening forms, as if the very room was being consumed by a pulsating living darkness. The air was filled with an unsettling chill, and I could feel the weight of tension with every breath. Nathan, now with an expression of absolute despair, pleaded for my help. His eyes, shining with a mix of fear and hallucination, reflected a terrifying understanding of what he had discovered. He asked for my assistance to understand what was happening, claiming that the watch had a power that went beyond human comprehension. I promised Nathan that I would take him to the hospital, but not without first investigating what was happening. I took the car, and with a heart pounding rapidly, we drove through the deserted streets of Seattle, while a growing sense of dread seemed to follow us. Each turn, the fear became palpable, as if something invisible was watching us, waiting for a moment of weakness. As we left the apartment, the hallway lights began to flicker erratically. The sound of muffled whispers dragged through the walls, growing in intensity until it became a ghostly chorus that seemed to resonate within our heads. The cold intensified with each step, and the sensation of being watched became oppressive and almost unbearable. The hallway seemed to stretch infinitely, as if space itself was being manipulated by an invisible and malevolent force. Finally, we arrived at the hospital. Nathan was treated by doctors, who dealt with his injuries with clinical precision, but I knew the real problem wasn't physical. While the doctors cared for him, I and a team of investigators decided to return to the apartment to examine the disturbing contents of the box. The expectation of discovering something that could explain the recent events was high, but what we found was even more terrifying. When we returned to the building, the apartment was completely empty. The metal box, the notebook, and the strange objects that Nathan had shown had disappeared without a trace. The apartment seemed to have been meticulously cleaned, as if no one had ever lived there. The walls, which had previously been covered with disturbing notes and photos, were now clean and devoid of any sign of recent activity. The environment was desolate, a perfect representation of the emptiness that permeated the investigation. It became clear that something very sinister was at play. The investigation revealed that Nathan's apartment had been rented by several tenants over the years, and some reported similar experiences: a constant feeling of being watched, hearing unexplained whispers, and seeing distorted shadows moving across the walls. However, none of them had been able to provide concrete evidence. Nathan's story seemed to be an echo of past events, a dark pattern that repeated with each new resident. The feeling that something was deeply wrong never left me. The case was closed without definitive answers, but the experience left an indelible mark on everyone involved. I continued my work as a social worker, but the memory of Nathan's case and the Watcher remained as a constant shadow. Each new client, each new apartment, brought with it a silent unease, a sense that something unknown and terrible was always lurking. Several months later, on a cold and rainy night, I was at home, trying to relax after a tiring day at work. The constant sound of rain hitting the window and the distant rumble of thunder were the backdrop to an unsettling silence. Suddenly, the sound of a clock, that same ticking sound I had heard at Nathan's house, began to echo through the house. The sound seemed to come from inside the walls, rhythmically, as if it were spinning backward, repeating an endless cycle. Panic took over when I realized the sound was getting louder and closer. I got up and began to investigate the house, my heart pounding rapidly. I opened cabinets, inspected every corner, but there was nothing. The sound continued, growing more intense, until finally, in a moment of desperation, I looked at the clock on my desk. To my horror, the dial was slowly spinning backward, just like Nathan's clock. At that moment, the environment around me seemed to distort, and a sensation of absolute terror enveloped me. The shadows on the walls writhed and stretched into grotesque forms, and I felt a sinister presence that seemed to be approaching. The fear became unbearable, and I wondered if the evil that Nathan had awakened had found a way to reach me. The line between reality and the supernatural was unraveling, and I realized that perhaps the Watcher was not an isolated entity, but something much more vast and terrifying, that could manifest at any moment, wherever you were. Nathan's story and the Watcher had transformed into something personal and terrifying, a nightmare that knew no bounds. The truth behind the shadows continued to hide in the dark, a constant reminder that evil may be closer than we imagine, lurking on the thin line between the known and the unknown. Report 8. It was early April 2023, and I had just turned 24. My friend Jake and I were eager for our annual getaway to Green Hollow, a secluded camp in the mountains of Colorado Springs, Colorado. Normally, we traveled there 2 or 3 times a year, drawn by the stunning views and the convenient distance from the city. The area was quite remote, with a small convenience store a few kilometers away and a dirt road leading to the camp. The road we followed was almost linear, with just one fork that led to a dead end. One path led to an old forest watchtower, while the other ended at an abandoned cabin, hidden behind dense trees. Winter had just ended, leaving behind a refreshing and cool landscape, ideal for our adventure. The air was light and the sky clear, promising a peaceful stay. We arrived at the camp around 5 p.m. on a Tuesday, much later than usual. Normally, we tried to arrive by noon, but our commitments had delayed us. With the sun setting quickly and temperatures dropping, we decided to light a fire instead of setting up a tent, since the car was relatively comfortable to sleep in. I slept in the back seat while Jake stayed in the passenger seat, with the window slightly open, just enough to allow a fresh breeze. We were exhausted and quickly fell asleep. The next day was quiet, But something was off. A persistent feeling of being watched hung over us. Every few hours, we heard the sound of leaves being crushed out of sight. Jake seemed to notice nothing strange, so I dismissed the discomfort, thinking it was just the local wildlife moving around. At night, the feeling of restlessness did not disappear. As the night progressed and silence took over the camp, the sense of presence became almost palpable. I was trying to relax in the back seat of the car, with my head leaning against the side window, when I heard something outside the car, a sound of leaves being crushed and soft but distinct footsteps. I whispered to Jake, but he was sound asleep. I turned off the phone and listened intently, hoping the sound was just a curious animal, but the noise persisted. After a few minutes, the sound ceased, and I thought it might have been an illusion caused by the darkness. I resumed using my phone, browsing through social media. 10 minutes later, I heard the noise again, this time closer. I turned off the phone and tried to focus on the darkness outside the window. The light from the phone only partially illuminated the surroundings, creating unsettling shadows. When my eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, an indescribable horror froze me in place. What initially appeared to be a distant shadow turned into a tangible nightmare. Two hands with deep scars and long chipped nails clung to the edge of the car window, their dirty dark claws as if they had been scratched by hell itself. The glass was fogged up by the pressure of the fingers, which dug into the glass as if trying to tear it open. The nails were sharp, and their menacing shine seemed to reflect the very essence of darkness. Behind the window, a face was pressed against the glass, the skin pale and worn. The being's breath created clouds of vapor that slowly dissipated, leaving a morbid and icy trail. The eyes, deep and empty like endless abysses, were fixed on mine, reflecting a darkness that seemed to devour all the light around it. They were black holes, where any glimpse of humanity had long vanished. Looking into those eyes was like staring directly into the heart of a nightmare. Terror completely paralyzed me. Every muscle in my body was in a kind of involuntary contraction, unable to move or make a sound. Time seemed to drag on, and each second was an endless torment of anguish and despair. The fear was so palpable that it seemed to form a physical layer over my skin, freezing my blood and tightening my chest. I was aware of every accelerated heartbeat, of every labored breath that I couldn't control. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the hands slowly began to move away from the window, as if an invisible force was pulling them away. The darkness swallowed the claws, and the sound of footsteps moving away sounded like a symphony of despair and malignancy, echoing in the night as a cruel reminder of the being's presence. The footprints grew fainter, until they were completely lost among the trees, leaving a suffocating silence in their place. I sat there, motionless in the back seat of the car, the feeling of panic dominating every thought. Terror seemed to be everywhere, seeping into every corner of my mind, making every shadow and every night sound a potential threat. Jake woke up to my agitated behavior and, seeing my pale, terrified face, realized something was deeply wrong. I tried to explain what I had seen, but he was skeptical, trying to rationalize the inexplicable. We got out of the car, flashlights in hand, our bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from the visceral fear that still consumed us. The investigation around the camp revealed smoky, distant footprints, but no concrete evidence of another person's presence. The shadows danced as the flashlights moved, making every movement a possible manifestation of what we were trying to understand. We chose to spend the rest of the night in the car, the atmosphere charged with an almost tangible fear, as if the car itself was our only protection against the darkness that surrounded us. Every crack, every noise of the wind, felt as if we were being watched, stalked by something invisible and malignant. When morning finally arrived, the fresh air and daylight could not completely dispel the feeling of terror that haunted us. We decided to return to the city earlier, but the experience was deeply rooted in our minds. The incident at Green Hollow was never fully explained. Although we returned to the site on other occasions, the fear persisted as a constant shadow, a reminder that there was something in the dark that could not be understood. We learned that the site had a history of disappearances and unexplained sightings, but nothing that fully explained what we experienced. The feeling of being watched, the terrifying vision of the hands at the window, and the empty eyes remain as scars in my memory. It's a constant reminder that there are things beyond human understanding, and that fear can lurk in the most unexpected places. If you've encountered something that defies explanation, share your experience. Meanwhile, I will continue to face the unknown, hoping that one day we might uncover the truth behind the shadows that dwell in the darkness. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support us. And more importantly, if you have any supernatural experiences, don't keep them to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the inexplicable, feed the collective curiosity, and who knows, maybe together we can unravel these mysteries that linger like mist between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, the unknown is always lurking, just a story away. And now, with night falling, who knows what shadows may emerge from the darkness to whisper another true story of terror.